Welcome to Grand Arena Matchmaking by Grand Arena Science. Um, this is a detailed video going into the details of the project. In this video, we're going to have Free 88, the principal scientist, go into the explanation of exactly how he started the project, all of the research that he did, and all of the logic that he used. And then I'll join him at the halfway mark and we'll talk about the summary and what we think are the important things you should take away from this. And then finally, we'll talk about sort of the unknowns, the things we don't know, the assumptions we made, and what's next, because there's a lot of work that Free is still going to be doing. So, Free 88, turning it over to you.
Thank you very much, Ken. I hope everyone is doing well today. I'm Free 88, happy to finally have the opportunity to talk about the over 2-month-long journey that I've been on, collecting data, analyzing data, just pouring through tons and tons of data, trying to gain some insight into the GAC matchmaking formula. Now, this section of the video is just going to talk about the process that I took collecting data, analyzing data. There is going to be an extension on the end of this video, or perhaps a separate video, where Ken and I are together talking more so about the results of the research project. And while it may be tempting to cut to the chase and just jump to the results section, I do hope everyone will take the time to first watch this process section. I think it will give everyone a better understanding of what some of the results mean. Now, there's good news and bad news. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have all of the answers that some people are hoping for, but I do believe we have found some very significant information in the numbers, and I believe we can make recommendations on what you should do with your roster if GAC matchmaking is something that's important to you. So, before we dive into things here, I'll briefly explain what we're looking at here on the screen. This is a Google Sheets document that contains basically all of the data from the research project. A link to this document will be made available, and everyone is welcome to look through it, pick it apart, do whatever you want with it. A little bit about the process for how I got started on this research project. One of the topics that Ken posted on the Grand Arena Science server as a potential research project was GAC matchmaking. And I've always been interested in the matchmaking process, what goes into it, what categories, what variables are in the matchmaking formula. So Ken and I got talking and I agreed to start doing some research. While we wanted to crack the code for GAC matchmaking, I think we both kind of understood pretty early on that that was unlikely. But that didn't mean that the project wouldn't have value. A large aspect of what we were looking to do was the ability to say category X impacts matchmaking more than category Y. Category A impacts matchmaking more than category B. And the thinking behind this was, if we can show the upgrades that are the best bang for your buck, then we can make recommendations on how to construct your roster in order to get favorable matchmaking, or really more importantly, how to avoid unfavorable matchmaking. So Ken introduced me to GAC Manager, which is an absolutely fantastic tool that I recommend to anyone who's interested in doing well in GAC. It's a spreadsheet similar to if you've seen like the hotpot graphics. It pulls a bunch of information from your roster as well as the rosters of the opponents in your bracket. And it was useful for me because of the research I was doing. I needed numbers that I could, pull and play around with. So GAC Manager being in a spreadsheet was very useful to me. So huge shout out to Sitter, and I apologize if I've completely butchered the pronunciation of that name. It's Ciiidr. That's his name on Discord. He is the creator of GAC Manager. So huge props to him, huge thanks to him. It would have been extremely difficult to do this project without GAC Manager. So I will show you a little bit about how GAC Manager works. Let's just jump to Ken here, March 9th. Basically, it just takes 2 or 3 minutes to get signed up, plug in your information, you create an account, and then you're going to have a spreadsheet available to you where once the bracket is set, you pull the ally codes of your 7 opponents and just plug them into the spreadsheet. I can zoom out a little bit here so you can see a little better. So you see Ken and then his 7 opponents. He basically plugged in the ally codes, ran the script in GAC Manager, and it populated all this data. And truly, any information that you want, there's a lot more than this. This is just a condensed version that I was using for the research project. Basically, any information you could want to compare your roster with your opponents is contained in GAC Manager. So I recommend it to anyone that takes GAC seriously, or even if you just want to do better. There will be a link leading you to be able to download GAC Manager in this Google Sheets document for anyone that wishes to do so. So, back to the research. I started to get a feel for how to do this research project by analyzing Ken's data from previous GAC brackets, because he's been using GAC Manager for a while. So it allowed me to get a chance to get a feel for the different categories, how the numbers were going to look, and just generally what to keep an eye out for. Ken and I knew we needed a lot of data, just tons of data. Analyzing one person's bracket for a few months in GAC just wasn't going to cut it as a sample size. So I set out to recruit players that were willing to send me the ally codes of the 7 players in their bracket each time matchmaking was set. I was able to recruit 20. I ultimately ended up with 18 data sources. It just didn't work out with 2 of them, which is totally fine. So I had 18 data sources, 8 players per bracket, and I ran my research for 3 weeks. So 18 data sources, 8 players per bracket over 3 weeks. That's over 400 rosters that we analyzed in this research project. Now, what I was trying to do was compare different categories together. The thinking was the categories, when I say categories, I mean Zetas, Relics, 6E mods, etc., etc. The categories that showed the lowest variance within a bracket were the most likely to be in the matchmaking formula. Categories that showed high variance within a bracket were less likely to be in the matchmaking formula. So I wanted to see how Zetas compared to Relics, how Relics compared to mods, and just compare the different variances between those categories. But part of the trick was all of these categories scale differently, right? Like someone can have, a couple 160 mods, but you're not going to see someone with 400 Zetas. So I needed a way of comparing the different categories that scale differently. And ultimately, that's why I used coefficient of variation. So my process was this. And I'll jump back to Ken's here just to show you guys an example. Once the join period ended and matchmaking was set and brackets were formed, I had my data sources send me the ally codes of the 7 players in their bracket. I would create a script for each of my 18 data sources and plug their ally codes in, run the numbers, which gave me something like what you see here on the screen. I then calculated the coefficient of variation, which you see in this column M, and then I sorted them from lowest variance to highest variance, because obviously that's ultimately what I was trying to see. What categories have the lowest variance, what categories have the highest variance. Now, on top of this, I can scroll over. So I did this for 3 weeks, March 9th, which was 5v5, March 23rd, which was 3v3, and March 30th, which was also 3v3. So for each of my 18 data sources, I combined the coefficient of variations for all 3 weeks, just averaged them out. So for each data source, I had a compiled coefficient of variation. On top of that, scroll to it here, you'll see for each week, so March 9th, March 23rd, March 30th, I compiled all of those coefficient of variations, added them together, divided them out, basically added them all together to again get the same thing I was just referring to. You'll see it here in column Y, the coefficient of variation for basically all of my data sources combined each week. Again, I did this for all 3 weeks, March 9th, March 23rd, and March 30th. On top of that, once the third week of data collection was complete, I took all 3 averaged out weeks, coefficient of variations, averaged those together, which basically gave me one final set of coefficient of variation for all the categories that I was looking at. The research wasn't done here. As I was working on this project, I ended up talking to 2 fine gentlemen by the names of Sendao and Wojojo. Now, Sendao and Wojo ended up doing some additional analysis. I should note that their research was focused solely on GP. They didn't take into account other variables, zetas, relics, 60 mods, that type of thing. Now, let's start with Sendao's analysis. Sendao wanted to see what the coefficient of variation looked like when you combined character GP with ship GP. So in other words, what is the coefficient of variation for the top 60 characters of someone's roster plus the top 20 ships? And how does that compare to the coefficient of variation for top 70 characters plus top 25 ships? So the original GAC Manager spreadsheet does not have all those extra GP categories in it. So King contacted the creator of GAC Manager, they worked together, we got the extra scripts created. I was able to run those extra scripts for the week of March 30th. Sendao and Wojo's data analysis was only on the last week of data collection, which was March 30th. So March 30th, in addition to running my original set of scripts, I also ran these extra scripts, which ended up being, I can pull it up here on the screen, character GP 60 through 80 and ship GP 8 through 32. Here's a sample of those extra scripts, as you can see, 60 through 80 for characters and 8 through 32 for ships. Now, Sendao ran his numbers. Wojo did a similar thing, and for the sake of trying to avoid having this be a 5-hour-long video, I won't go into all the detail here, but basically Wojo has a bot that works similarly to GAC Manager. It can pull the roster information of any player and basically pull the characters from 1 through whatever you want it to do. So for the last week of data collection, March 30th, in addition to running my original scripts plus the extra scripts for Sendao, I plugged the ally codes for each bracket into Wojo's bot, which allowed Wojo to collect all that data information and run his numbers. There is a sheet in here as well talking about Wojo's data. Anyone that's interested in looking at some of the specifics of this, I recommend going through this Google Sheet, because honestly there's so much information and data here, it's impossible to cover in one Google Sheet document or even in a couple videos. So of course, as is the case with my findings, the results of Sendao and Wojo's research can be found here in the Google Sheets document. So huge shout out to both of those guys, Sendao and Wojo, not only for their additional analysis, but also for serving as kind of a soundboard for me throughout this project, just to bounce some ideas off of and just to talk through some of the numbers that we were finding. So where has all this research gotten us? As mentioned at the top, Ken and I are going to make an additional video talking about the results. I hope everyone watches that as well. Obviously, that's where all the good information is at. Look through the spreadsheet, watch the videos, try and absorb all this information that you can. And okay, thank you for watching. Take care, and I'll see you guys soon for the video covering the results.
Hello again. I am back. Free never left, and we are here going over the results of the matchmaking research. We saw a very detailed version from Free explaining how everything worked, and now we're going to go to the the takeaways or the summaries that we each think are important and what we should focus on. So we're here looking at the matchmaking summary sheet. Free, what are the main things we should pay attention to in here? What are the takeaways?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the top 66 and top 70 character GP ended up having the lowest coefficients of variation. which is basically what we expect, right, based off of what CG has told us matchmaking should be.
Yep.
It is a little notable that top 66 ended up with a lower variance than top 70. Going into this project, I expected it to be flipped. But if you don't just look at column I, but if you scroll over and look at rows 15 and 16, you'll actually see that for all 3 weeks, including March 9th, which was the week of 5v5, that top 66 had a lower variance than top 70. So it doesn't just seem to be, a wacky stat for a small sample. It was the case with all 3 weeks. So that's notable. And then as far as the non-GP categories go, Zetas and number of Gear 13s had the lowest variance. But Zetas come in at 9.2%, which is a really large number, at least when you compare it to the GP categories. And what that tells me is that either non-GP categories such as Zetas are either not in the matchmaking formula, or if they are, they just have a very minimal impact, at least relative to the GP categories.
Makes sense. All right.
And then I'll send down Wojo's results just a little bit. I think the biggest takeaway is that they produced coefficient of variations lower than anything that I came up with in my data. And of course, this is the case with all my data. If anybody's interested in some of the specifics on their results, you can find them in the Google Sheets document.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think we'll talk about it a bit too when we get to the sort of what we don't know and the next steps to some of the stuff that you want to validate when we do the next round.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's go and look a little bit then at just the JPEG that I'm sure most people have seen as well, where effectively what you did was take the GP impact in-game of upgrading each of these components, and then looking at the coefficient for each of those and seeing effectively what the impact is, like if your assumptions about the prioritization is accurate, or regardless of whether it's accurate or not, we know that these are the components that actually have a relative amount of impact on the matchmaking from the analysis.
Yeah. So while we're hopeful to, sort of crack the code, as I mentioned in the previous portion of this video, the bigger aspect of this project was to just find what categories are sort of the best upgrades you can do for your roster. And that's the main thing this JPEG shows. If you just look at the poor value, great value, best value over on the right side of the JPEG, you can see how much larger the numbers are for Zetas than, for example, 6E mods. So big numbers are bad here, small numbers are good. And I mean, you can just look at the average impact of Zeta, which is 2220, and then it's just a tiny number when you look at the mods, 6E mods, which is 17. So that's the biggest thing, is 6E mods are great improvements for your roster.
Yeah, definitely.
They're the best thing. But, and then if you're just looking at relics, Relic 4 seems to be that magic number to just stop at. And of course, CG does, the little new Rancor raid where you need at least Relic 5. But if we're just looking at it GAC perspective, Relic 2 is really good too, but Relic 4, it might be a number that you need to stop at.
And also just going to any relic level, like from G12 to G13, because even though it's not technically 100% accurate, the 210 that's mentioned there is just the finisher piece. But plenty of people will have a G12 character with 3 or 4 or 5 pieces. And it's obviously expensive to farm gear, but power level from a GAC perspective, you gain so much power for very little galactic power. It's a huge benefit there. It's a good value too, if you have the gear.
For sure. As you mentioned, it's a little tricky calculating the difference between Gear 12 and Gear 13, since there's technically 6 gear pieces to jump from one level to the next. But yeah, I mean, if you just look at the numbers, Zeta is about 10 times as costly as taking a character from Gear 12 to Gear 13.
That's
if you
crazy.
ask me, yeah, I'd much rather take 10 characters from Gear 12 to Gear 13 than just apply one Zeta. I think that's going to improve my roster in my matchups much more than just a simple Zeta will.
Yeah, and that actually leads us into the next section we want to cover here, which is we have two more little bits at the end of this video. One is the things that we don't know, the unknowns, what we'd like to try and prove, and what we still want to do research on, and then what is next. But talking about zetas and the impact versus G13, we were chatting earlier about the troopers like Veers and Piet, or Veers and Stark or something. I forget the exact example, but how like a Stark that's relic 8 or gear 8 with a Zeta. Gear 9 with a Zeta is like the same GP as a relic 2 or relic 3.
Relic 2, yeah. So this is another sheet that's in the Google Sheets document for anybody that wants to look at it. But yeah, basically a gear 9 2 Zeta character takes up more GP than a relic 2 0 Zeta character. So if you just think of it from the perspective of what would you rather your roster be made up of, gear 9 plus 2 Zetas or relic 2 plus 0 Zetas, obviously some Zetas are essential to kind of make a team work, but generally speaking, 90% at least plus of cases, you're going to be much better off with a roster of relic 2 and no Zetas than gear 9 2 Zetas.
Yeah, and that obviously depends to, well, interestingly, I'm looking at the numbers as I say this, like from a mathematical perspective, the more GP you have, the less overall impact Zetas have, because it's, or less overall impact any improve has, or GP increase has. But looking at the numbers, even at like the 8.2 million GP accounts, Zetas still have a huge impact, even less than at a lower GP, like at the 7.4 million GP. It's quite interesting. No matter what GP level you're at, it's still very high impact to put on a Zeta, basically.
Yeah, and you can see that if you look at some of the detailed researches. There's definitely variances between different GPs, but the same principles apply whether you're 5 million, 8 million, whatever. Zetas are bad. Invest in mods, go crazy with mods, and just be very frugal with your Zetas.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so let's move on here. I'll leave this screen up while we talk about it, but what are the unknowns? What are the things that we definitely know are gaps in this research, and things that we're planning on looking at in the future?
Yeah, so one of the things that a lot of people speculate is not just what categories go into the matchmaking formula, but kind of when brackets are formed. So one of the ones that I've seen talked about on the forum and multiple Discord servers is what I'm going to call the bucket theory. That term comes from Wojo, so credit to him, as well as a number of sort of the aspects that I'm going to talk about here. They come from my discussions with him. So imagine CG server creates just a ton of buckets, and you can call these pods. I think that was one of the terms I've seen on the forums before. You can call them whatever you want, but basically these buckets are what eventually become the brackets. So once each bucket is filled with 8 players, it becomes a bracket. So everyone has a matchmaking value assigned to them, and this value is whatever CG's formula is. So variable X plus variable Y plus variable Z equals your matchmaking value. And what happens is when a player joins GAC, the server calculates your matchmaking value, and it looks at all of the open buckets, and it tries to find a bucket that currently has players' matchmaking values close to yours. And we don't know what the magical threshold might be that it's looking for, but when you join GAC and you get assigned that matchmaking value, if there's a bucket, an open bucket with players in it that have a close enough roster or matchmaking value to you, you get dropped in that bucket. Once the bucket is full of 8 players, it's closed off, it's set into the queue, ready to be thrown out after the matchmaking period ends. And when the server is scanning these buckets trying to find a match, if there isn't an open bucket where your matchmaking value falls within a certain threshold of any of them, then you just get placed in a currently empty bucket. And then throughout the remainder of the join period, other players will be placed into your bucket that are within, again, that magical threshold, whatever it might be.
That's interesting, because I don't know if you want to talk about it now. Maybe it's something in the next steps. But some of the theories about when exactly you join has an impact on, or when you join, we can see it has an impact on when your bucket is finalized, I guess, at the beginning of the GAC period.
Yep. We have a bit of a working theory there, as you alluded to. We'll touch on in the last section of this video.
All right. Well, let's move on to that then. The thanks and the next steps. So it's perfect entry into that for thank you. I mean, we've talked a lot about this, but anyway, this research would not be done without you. I mean, I don't know if you're at hundreds of hours yet, but certainly many tens of hours, and a lot of paying attention right as payout starts to gather all the data. Who else would you like to thank?
I need to thank you, first of all, for the opportunity to do the research. I could have done the research, regardless, but without the audience to present it to that you have, and obviously without some of your advice with GAC Manager and general wisdom, there would have been no project in the first place. So thanks to you. And then,
I'm not so sure about that, but
he's very humble. Sitter or cider, hopefully between the two of us, we've nailed down that pronunciation one way or the other. He's the creator of GAC Manager. Huge thanks to him.
Yeah, by the way, I just want to interrupt real quick. I love that spreadsheet. I've been using it for well over a year now. It's awesome.
It was fantastic, truly. The 18 data sources: Amriel, Angel Devil, Artemis, Bitcoin, Brill Council, Charger, Lieutenant Chocolate, Fabivs, Free, myself, JKB, Kin, Nemesis is Alt, Nightwolf, Pokey, Reptile, Sendout, and Vix. Huge thanks to those 18. Obviously, this project literally isn't able to be done without large sample size. So thanks to those 18, and then Sendout and Wojo for their additional data analysis.
Cool. And what's next? What are your plans for the upcoming years or months at least?
Yeah, so let me flip to my little cheat sheet here. So obviously, we don't know when it's going to go into effect yet, but we know CG has announced incoming changes to GAC. Once those changes take place, we are going to continue our data collection, and we're curious to see how that new data is going to compare to the old data. And then I'm going to attempt to find patterns. So obviously some players consistently get favorable matchups and some players consistently get unfavorable matchups. I want to try and find patterns within those players' rosters / brackets to see what's causing those consistently favorable / unfavorable matchups. And then, as we touched on a little bit earlier, I want to try and find concrete evidence for when you join GAC impacts your matchups. I don't want to spoil too much here, but we have a bit of a working theory that the earlier you join GAC, the earlier your bracket will be sent to you during those 5 minutes after the join period ends. It's a working theory. We have a little bit of evidence for it so far. I'm just hoping to get a bigger sample size and find some concrete evidence for that.
And exactly what impact it could have on choices on when you want to join as well. Because I know there's been a lot of theories thrown around whether you join 10 minutes before or 10 hours before that you would get better or worse, but hard to say.
It's possible. We don't know. Yeah. And I mean, a significant reason for why we have been unable, at least so far, to nail down the specific formula for what matchmaking is because there's so much randomness within the matchmaking process. And I think part of that is because we don't know some of the things such as when brackets are formed. So I think if we can, maybe not 100% know, but get a pretty good feeling for when those brackets are formed, it can help us start to follow the breadcrumbs to get some other answers, such as possibly solving the mystery of what the matchmaking formula actually is.
That would be fun if we ever get this. Well, we'll get closer for sure, but yeah, definitely a lot of interesting info there.
Absolutely.
All right, Pri, thank you for an awesome discussion, going over our results discussion. Thank you to the viewers for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this and learned a little bit. Anything you want to say before we cut off this video? Just the last little thing I'll say is there's obviously tons and tons and tons of data here,
anyone that's interested, I hope you look at the Google Sheets document to see some of the specific stuff. If anybody ever wants to talk about it, tell me how bad of a job I did with it. If you have any ideas for how to improve the process, hit me up on Discord. If you're in the Google Sheets, on the very first page you come to, I've got my tag on there, but it's free, hashtag 6938. So hit me up. I'll be happy to talk about all this research project.
Perfect. And in the video, I'll have we'll type out your Discord username there if people want to. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And
thanks, everyone.
we'll have more to come. Cheers.
Absolutely.